Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. One of the things that the Community Mobility Committee wants to do is have frank and honest discussion and education and information sharing around topics. And tonight's topic, as you know, is around Vision Zero. And our goal is to create a baseline, if you will, of information and knowledge around what Vision Zero is and how it can be applied to St. Louis. And with us today, this evening, we have Tiffany Smith, who is with Vision Zero. We have Bailey Waters, who is with Kansas City Vision Zero. Is that fair? All right. Jason Waldron from KC Vision Zero. And our excellent host for this evening and assistant is Dawn Walter. So we're going to start with Tiffany Smith. Tiffany, good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Tiffany, if you would briefly say who you're with, your position, and a little bit about yourself that you want to share, and then lead us into the conversation of what is Vision Zero.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Smith. I'm the program manager with Vision Zero Network. We are a nonprofit organization that I often like to describe a bit as like a part resource hub, part communications hub. We are essentially a collaborative campaign to help communities reach their goals of Vision Zero, to eliminate traffic fatalities and severe injuries while promoting safe, healthy, and equitable mobility for all people. Some of our work includes providing a strong advocacy voice for Vision Zero and the safe system approach at the national level, supporting public sector staff and community-based leaders in setting and advancing their Vision Zero goals, developing and sharing resources on best practices, roadway safety strategies, techniques, and how to center equity and inclusiveness in this work. And along with that, providing learning opportunities such as peer exchanges, informational calls and webinars, and other forums to sort of share this information and learn, as well as continuing to be inclusive and equitable in safety work. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Second. Okay. Can everybody see all right? Great. So I
Tiffany,
already
we can also see your presenter view. I don't know if you have another screen to put that on.
Okay. Let me try one more thing, sorry. Okay. Okay, great. So I already gave my spiel about what Vision Zero Network is and what I do. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into what we'll be covering today. We're going to talk a bit about what Vision Zero is. We're going to talk about the safe system approach and discuss some examples of Vision Zero and safe system in practice. And then I'll share some resources at the end. And so what is Vision Zero? It is a strategy to eliminate traffic fatalities and severe injuries while increasing healthy, equitable mobility for all. The approach recognizes that people will sometimes make mistakes, and so we have a responsibility to design and operate a transportation system that accounts for these inevitable mistakes. And so it's really important to recognize that in this Vision Zero space, there's a lot of different interpretations as to what it is. And oftentimes people confuse it for just a goal or a slogan or a tagline, but really it is a fundamental shift in how we think about and do work on roadway safety. The Vision Zero approach compared to the traditional approach, backtracking. The first step in sort of adopting Vision Zero is integrating the safe system approach. On this slide, I've highlighted the difference between the traditional approach and the safe system approach. The traditional approach focuses on preventing crashes, while the safe system approach is a focus on recognizing that, hey, crashes are going to happen, but we can prevent death and serious injuries from occurring when they do happen. The traditional approach focuses on changing individual human behavior, while the safe system approach aims to sort of design or account for human mistakes into the design. The traditional approach focuses on controlling speeding, while the safe system approach reduces system kinetic energy. And what I mean by that, when I say that, is, you know, the human body is fragile, and it can only withstand certain speeds when it's hit by a vehicle. And so it's really important to recognize that speed should be set to mitigate the impact if and when that does happen. The traditional approach focuses on individual responsibility and safety, whereas the safe system approach emphasizes and underscores the importance of there being a shared responsibility. We all have a shared responsibility in our roadway safety work. And I like to say that it also encourages building empathy into the system. Rather than shifting blame on victims or to drivers, it's recognizing that, hey, we have a problem here, and so let's incorporate these interventions into our system and account for them. And then finally, the biggest thing is the traditional approach focuses on reacting based on crash history, while the safe system approach proactively identifies risks for crashes and then addresses them accordingly. So it's less about, hey, a crash is occurring at a corner, let's, make an intervention. It's like looking at data and saying, hey, we found that doing XYZ mitigates this crash risk. So now we're just going to scale it up throughout the whole city. I bring up the safe system approach now just because I do want to highlight it as sort of being like an early and core pillar of Vision Zero work, but I'm going to get into it more specifically later on in the presentation. So the first step would be adopting a high injury network. The high injury network is really helpful in identifying patterns, where crashes are occurring, the types of crashes that occur. Oftentimes, we encourage cities to also layer their crash data with other demographic data like race, income, percentage of school-age children. So you can, once you have those layers, you're able to observe what groups are being disproportionately impacted. For example, are crashes more often occurring in lower income communities? Are they occurring in communities with a high percentage of school-aged children? Are they occurring in communities that have large arterial roads and haven't had a lot of infrastructure investment in the last, or more recent years? And then I also want to emphasize that it's really important to, along with looking at crash data, you also want to look at qualitative data. What does your community say? Getting community input, because oftentimes numbers data doesn't really paint a full picture. So for example, on a road, a large major road, maybe there's not a super high crash rate there, but maybe that's because, or there's not a lot of incidents of interactions between drivers and pedestrians or cyclists, but maybe that's because people just in general don't feel safe walking and biking there. So it's really important to supplement both types of data to paint the full picture. Next, you'll want to create a Vision Zero task force. This task force is designed to really encourage interdepartmental collaboration, and to sort of get out of silos. Oftentimes in transportation or in the past, it's really been separated into distinct, you have transportation, you have public works, planning, health department, but with creating a Vision Zero task force, it's recognizing that, hey, these issues are related. Transportation impacts access to health, it impacts access to employment, it impacts access to social services. And so recognizing that and including those folks into your task force allows for you to better plan, but it also allows for you to incorporate equity and inclusiveness as well in the process. Along with that, the first sort of step is getting your city, whether it's your mayor or your city council or your city manager, to sort of make a formal commitment to Vision Zero. I've included some examples here, but we think it's really a really important early step in encouraging accountability and making sure that it's not just a tagline or a slogan, but making sure that there's actually, a paper trail, and there's buy-in, there's accountability and support for the issue. Moreover, there was something else I was going to say. I forgot, but most importantly, you want to get your city or council or mayor or city manager to adopt. Also, it's really important to setting a goal with a specific date is really important as well in encouraging that accountability. Next, we want to develop a strong Vision Zero action plan. This is often done about a year after the city makes a formal commitment, but there's no set timeline on how this has to be done. But the whole point of the action plan is to show that you're doing or incorporating the safe system approach, you're incorporating those principles in a way that is proactive and preventative, and that you're doing things differently than you would with a traditional roadway safety strategy. And so it's all about laying out what specific, whether it's managing speeds or designing roads differently, adding bike lanes, sort of laying out who are the key stakeholders, who are the key owners of which specific aspect of their Vision Zero work, whether it's adding a bike lane or narrowing the road, who are the owners, what's the projected timeline for the change, what are the sort of intended or expected pushbacks or challenges in making those changes, and sort of laying out specific and measurable action steps towards reaching your Vision Zero goals. The important thing to remember is that it's also like a living, breathing document. It changes and it will evolve as you move forward in your Vision Zero progress. So as I mentioned, I just want to talk briefly about the safe system approach, because I would say this is what makes Vision Zero fundamentally different from the traditional roadway approach to roadway safety, or the EASE approach, as you might have heard, which is engineering, education, and enforcement. The safe system approach is human-centered and is proactive. You'll hear me say this a zillion times today. And the key principles are that people make mistakes, people are vulnerable, and that is safety is proactive. Transportation systems should be designed in ways that identify and address safety problems rather than wait for crashes to occur. And so how do you shift to a safe system approach, or shift to Vision Zero and do safe systems? An easy place to start is with safe streets and safe speeds. When it comes to safe speeds, as I mentioned, it goes back to that kinetic energy. You can keep impacts on the human body at tolerable levels. Another aspect is designing streets for their desired safe speeds rather than the predominant speed, and lowering speed limits and designing for those speeds. So for example, you can lower a speed limit in your community, but if it's on a wide, like arterial road, for example, where there's 4 lanes, and just changing the sign to 25 miles per hour isn't necessarily going to change the behavior associated with driving on that road. And so with the safe system approach, it involves like, hey, we're going to change the speed limit, but we're also going to make the road narrower. We're going to add crosswalks. We're going to add leading pedestrian intervals, and maybe we're going to add a bike lane and sidewalks. And all of those things will combine to sort of reinforce the speed, the lowered speed itself. In addition, safe streets sort of manifests in designing roadways that physically separate people walking and biking from drivers. So this is protected bike lanes, sidewalks, designing roadways that give ample space to people traveling outside of cars, and using traffic calming and proactive road design to actively slow speeds and improve visibility. And then at the bottom here, I just have centering vulnerable populations experiencing a disproportionate rate of injuries and fatalities. And so throughout all of this is keeping in mind that equity and sort of disproportionate rates of death and fatalities in this space should always be paid attention to as it relates to all of these principles. And so it's a good segue. Safe system design. You design roads for people, all road users. And when you do that, when you have a complete street, when you have a bike lane and you have a sidewalk and you have crosswalks and you have roads that allow for space for cars, but also have visibility for people walking and biking and rolling around, what you get is a street that is self-enforcing. The design enforces the speed, and the speed supplements the design. And so what happens is you get less reliance on punitive measures to counteract human behavior when it comes to speeding, for example. And essentially what results is safe and equitable streets, safe and equitable spaces for all road users. And so just going to briefly highlight some examples of the safe system approach in practice. In Seattle, there's a speed management program. In 2018, Seattle completed a study showing that lowering speed limits on signs could slow average vehicle speeds by 2 miles per hour and reduce injuries by 20%. And so they saw the results of the study and then said, okay, hey, we're going to scale this up. And so as a result, the city began lowering speed limits across the entirety of the city proactively. And so you'll see on this graph here, sort of after they initially adopted Vision Zero in 2015, when they made that approach or shift to being more proactive in 2019 to 2020, and sort of scaling up a 25-mile-per-hour speed limit. And I also just wanted to note that they did this all without increasing or involving traditional enforcement measures in a way to sort of center equity in this space. And the reducing injuries by 20% was without enforcement. Another example is their leading pedestrian intervals program. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, essentially it just gives pedestrians a head start. It's particularly helpful for left turns. This is something they've also done in New York City. But the LPI program in Seattle, the same study showed that crashes at traffic signals represented 20% of serious and fatal pedestrian collisions in the city. And they also looked at analysis in other cities, including New York City. And when they found that it resulted in 35% less serious injuries, they began to make leading pedestrian intervals a standard practice. And so whenever a signal was retimed, they would install a leading pedestrian interval. And you'll see here on the graph, sort of the number of traffic signals that began to have an LPI increase from 2019 to 2022. And so just laying out sort of what makes this a good safe system example, that it proactively rolls out street safety improvements rather than waiting for complaints or injuries or deaths to occur. uses safety interventions proven to slow speeds and separate road users in space. And they did this all while sort of centering equity and without disproportionately impacting those in communities of color or those in lower income communities that are more likely to have interactions with police. Another example is Austin's speed management program. And this started in 2019. And it was about sort of aiming to improve safety and livability of streets with specific design interventions, such as pedestrian islands, as referenced in this photo here. And this program, again, proactively assess locations where speeding is likely to be a problem in the future, and how they prioritize this assessment. They looked at where these sites were and whether they were located in designated equity analysis zones. These zones were areas with high rate of school age children, high rate areas of seniors, high rate of those living below the federal poverty level, whether there was the presence or absence of sidewalks, the presence or absence of bike facilities, and their proximity to public transit. And so again, I'm saying this a zillion times, but I hope that's one thing you'll take away, is that it's proactive, assessing the streets citywide for problems with dangerous speeding, not waiting for complaints to occur, using proven safety measures such as a pedestrian island, slowing speeds that also separates road users in space, but also improves visibility. And then with the equity analysis component, prioritizing areas that have been historically underserved or are further from transit or have a high concentration of people walking and biking. And then this is the Safe Streets for Seniors program in New York City. In 2022, New York City Department of Transportation completed a study showing that older New Yorkers were disproportionately at risk for being injured or killed while walking in traffic. And so they evaluated pedestrian conditions from a senior's perspective citywide. They also looked at demographic data of neighborhoods, high concentrations of older New Yorkers. And in response, they're also doing similar to what Seattle did, is that they're now scaling up LPIs so that seniors now have more time to cross the street in different neighborhoods throughout the city. Initially, that was phase one. And now they're now shifting to, instead of just focusing on areas with high concentration seniors, they're now pivoting to, okay, now we're going to install LPIs throughout the city. Yeah, similar as I mentioned before, identifying safety intervention that works and scaling it up. And also one thing I thought was important is just also identifying senior citizens as a vulnerable population. That's why it's really important to, when you do the high injury network, to sort of pair it with any other demographic data so you can see what the full picture is. And finally, I just have this slide on just providing some steps you can take to sort of begin on your road to Vision Zero and on your road to incorporating the safe system approach. It's like, you know, making safe mobility your top priority. Again, being proactive instead of reactive, using data to allocate limited safety resources. And by data, I mean both quantitative and qualitative, community engagement along with numbers data, community input, centering people and designing for people, especially those outside of motor vehicles, elevating equity and roadway safety planning, strategy and outcomes. And then another thing I would note is using quick build projects. These can be really good to sort of test out an intervention, especially one that can be controversial, like a bike lane or sort of placemaking, whether you're taking some parking away to essentially narrow the road. all of those things, oftentimes they have, a lot of pushback. And so you can do a quick build project, which is essentially something that is temporary. You can put planters on the sides of your bike lanes as a way to sort of begin to transition. And what particularly I think of Jersey City and Hoboken, how they do all of their projects is they often start with something temporary. And so they'll paint the road like a color, or paint, like when you would turn a right turn, paint the angle there. And then slowly over time, people get used to making a wider turn, or slowly over time, people get used to not having that street accessible to driving. Same goes for carless spaces. Oftentimes people build their way up. So it's whether it's painting or limiting car access on weekends, slowly building up to limiting car access on evenings during the week. And then eventually it becomes just a pedestrian only space. And so finally, just some resources that I have linked here. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. Looking forward to questions. Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Tiffany, so much for your presentation. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I have one, and then after a few questions, we will get Bailey and Jason on board to talk about what they did and are doing, I should say, in Kansas City. But Tiffany, as you look around the country, at what point do cities, towns, counties, whatever you want to call them, when do they start educating and then engaging the public in these issues?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I say it really starts with the officials who make or have the power to make this change. I just want to reiterate that, the traditional approach often puts the onus on, individual drivers or pedestrians. And so the important point I want to make is that it's systemic. And so what's the most important is getting the folks who are in charge, or who have, whether it's planners or engineers or public works people, to sort of recognize that they can incorporate these safety interventions in ways that, are proactive. They don't have to wait for something to occur. And so I would say it does happen over time, but the main approach is a Vision Zero, and that we're taking a step back. We're going upstream into the factors that sort of cause crashes to occur in the first place, whether that's, poor lighting, or wide lanes or arterial roads, or not enough crosswalks, or too high of speeds. And so it's really looking at the systems that currently exist. And over time, what we find is that, I refer to New York because that's where I'm based, is that oftentimes people end up changing their behavior because of the way that the road actually, like the way it looks, the way that it's designed. And what you have is, like, after seeing it enough or driving on that road enough, they eventually drive slower, calmer, and yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes, Cynthia asks, how can you convince the city to embrace quick build? Is it cost effectiveness / changing behaviors, overall acceptance goes up?
Yeah, I would say it's a bit of cost effectiveness. You can sort of try something out without it being this huge, like, budget overhaul, something, quick and easy. It's also sort of helpful at getting people used to the idea, whether it's like taking a parking space away, or creating a pedestrian only space, or putting a bike lane. It's just a way to sort of get people kind of used to the idea of it. And you can always frame it as like, hey, we're trying this out for a period of time. It doesn't have to be forever. But I use Jersey City and Hoboken, for example, because what they've found is that if they always start that way, over time, the public, if it's there for 4 months, the public is then like, oh, I actually, I was against this at first, but now that it's there, I actually like the change. And so framing it to the public as like, hey, it's not forever, but we're trying this out.
Dawn, are there any others?
Matt just added a comment, more of a comment than a question. Is it a matter of setting priorities in our transportation infrastructure? At one level, it is simple, love cars a little less, love people a little more.
I mean, I would say that's sort of the core of Vision Zero and Safe System, is that you're putting people at the center of it, at the center of this work. And so you're prioritizing their safety, their mobility, and it's sort of like, yeah, exactly. And one thing I always like to say is like, you're just giving people options. You're giving people a bike lane, you're giving them a sidewalk, and maybe they feel more comfortable walking somewhere or biking somewhere, and sort of also freeing up space so that there's less cars as well. I think it goes hand in hand.
Thank you. Any others? Dawn?
Not at the moment. I think we can bring Bailey and Jason in.
All right.
Oh, wait, sorry. Aaliyah just added, any tips for how to create buy-in with city officials, especially when there is resistance?
Well, I guess it would depend in terms of buy-in for Vision Zero overall, or buy-in for a specific change. For buy-in Vision Zero overall, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, I would say, looking at other examples, while Vision Zero is relatively new in the United States, it is gaining traction. There's a lot of cities out there, and not just big cities, like massive cities like New York and LA, but there are a lot of smaller cities. I actually had someone from Muhlenberg, Pennsylvania, and Macon, Georgia, reach out to me relatively recently, and they're in the process of, Macon, Georgia has officially adopted Vision Zero in their community. So just highlighting like the work that currently goes on, and also the successes, I think, are really helpful. I think people are afraid of, what they don't know, but if 40,000 people are dying each year and we're doing the same thing, I think there's cause to sort of consider trying a different approach, so that maybe less than 115 people can die every day. Is also, I think too, I have a public health background, and so I think also framing it as a public health issue is really helpful, because it is something that, yes, crashes are going to occur, but they don't have to be as serious and as fatal as they currently are. And so I think those are all tips. And then one thing I also just in general like to say is just a general frame shift of saying crashes, not accidents, because accidents, seem like infer that, this is an act of God and that there's nothing that you can do to control for it. But a crash is a crash. And so all those little things can be really helpful at getting people to understand, but it's hard.
And we'll hear some about that, but with Jason and Bailey and how Kansas City got started. Tiffany, you are certainly welcome to stay. Thank you for your presentation, and I'm certainly we'll be in touch later because I got a whole bunch of other questions, but we'll move on to Bailey and Jason now. So thank you, Tiffany. And Bailey and Jason.
Thanks
Kansas
so much,
City.
everyone.
Thank you. How did it get started? Where are you all now?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Jason Waldron, I'm the transportation director in Kansas City, Missouri. With me today, and I'll let her tell her more about herself, is Bailey Waters. But I gotta say, Tiffany made me feel really good. I don't know if we knew exactly what we were doing, but she kind of, to some degree, helped describe how we implemented Vision Zero program. So I'll try not to repeat But there was a lot of good things in that presentation for sure, at least from our own experience. Our journey with Vision Zero started in the spring of 2020, and through a ordinance that was passed by our city council, basically directing staff to develop policy and go and also at the same time make some improvements right away. And we had dabbled with complete streets and road diets, but steal one of Tiffany's lines, that this ordinance made us accountable to make sure we did this, because we like to say, for so long, Kansas City's no exception. Our roads dictated what our communities look like, and now we're trying to flip that script and let our communities determine what our roads look like. We're doing a project right now on Truman Road, if anybody's familiar with it, like a 6 and 7 lane wide road. At one time, that road was needed to be that wide, but that time is not now. And so repurposing and reinventing what our roadways look like. But getting back to Vision Zero, sorry for a little soapbox moment there. That resolution had a couple components to it. I already mentioned that it was about policy and then concrete improvements. But it also told us to do two things. One is base our decisions on data, develop a high injury network so we know where these crashes and fatalities are happening. And two, put equity at the forefront, which we didn't have to reinvent the wheel there, because we have what's called life X zones. There's zip codes within our community with lower life expectancy rates. It turned out that most of our problem areas or higher crash rates were in the older and more underserved areas of our community. So it really dovetailed, quite frankly. But anyways, so what do we do after resolution? We form a task force. And I'll be honest, for about a year, this task force met and we talked and we talked and talked and did very little. We were kind of paralyzed by this idea of developing this new action plan policy. And so during that time, during COVID, we had quite a change in leadership, almost on all levels at the city of Kansas, new city manager, and that kind of, had a ripple effect through all our departments. And at that time, basically was told, okay, we want you, Jason, and some others, we want you to assume the leadership of this and get something done. And I'm an engine nerd, so I'm all about getting those shiny objects built and things like that. So right away, rather than let us be paralyzed by this daunting action plan development, we put together what we call the year one road plan. And that is where we went out and we did those things that were in the resolution. And some of the things you heard, we made improvements for 7 of our highest fatality intersections. We put LPIs that Tiffany did a really nice job explaining at 50 of our intersections. We put in 50 traffic calming projects. And then, of course, we developed that high injury network. So what really, I don't know how intentional we were, but doing it that way really allowed us to learn a few things. So when we sat down and wrote that action plan, which we did this last year, we were more educated and we knew more about what we wanted to do than if we would have started with that. I don't know if that's the best practice or not, but that's our story. And just really quickly, so it's really, and then if you do this successfully, right, you are likely going, in order to reduce speeds, which is the #1 direct factor of fatalities, you're going to have an impact on the volumes of your roads. And so just being very upfront and honest about it, before we did, for instance, the intersection improvements, I went to council and I said, look, there's going to be twice a day where people are going to maybe have to wait an extra traffic signal cycle. We're talking seconds to minutes. That is going to happen, but that's going to allow us to slow speeds down in these different areas of the city. So just being really upfront, having your story based on data, equity at the forefront, that's what really has carried our message. And then one other piece of advice I'll say, because Tiffany had kind of alluded to it, is really making sure once you get going, that you protect the brand of Vision Zero, because Vision Zero is a great thing, but it means something, and not letting it being used as an excuse to do other things. Every time we have a good policy, people like to use it to try to do other things. So really protecting that brand is something that we do even to this day. And then I guess the two last things I'd leave you with, and I want to open up for question and answers because I know that's the most valuable, is a creative delivery. we didn't start out with a big budget line item to do these things. We had to find ways to implement these things. So we looked at, we had a little bit of standalone community funding, but looking at other programs like our street resurfacing program, making sure it was inherent how we designed and chose capital projects and using those to deliver these things. And then lastly, which is my segue to Bailey to tell you kind of where we're going now, is at the time it started, we didn't have any dedicated staff, and there's just a few of this trying to make this happen, over lunch, after hours, and on the weekends. And quickly, as we found some success, we realized we needed some staff that are dedicated to this stuff. I like to say that wake up thinking about it and go to bed thinking about it. And so once we were able to show some success, that allowed us to approach our city manager and say, hey, if we really want to be serious about this, we need some staff dedicated. And then a unicorn fell out of the sky named Bailey Waters, who's on here tonight. And she has been fantastic and really has taken us up a notch. So Bailey, all yours to tell them what we're doing now and what we're planning on doing going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. One, I'd say it's just super awesome to have city leadership on board for this. Like, without their support, I don't know if we would be able to get as much done. So like, I guess advice or guidance for St. Louis would be to get your public works team or your leadership on board as much as you can. And then allowing to have the more permanent staff like we're able to have in our multimodal team here now. But in terms of where we're headed, we're continuing kind of where we've started by continuing more intersections that we identify, and also continuing with LPI implementation, kind of like in sections at a time, sections of the city, so they happen gradually and people can get used to them. And then continuing with more and more protected bike lanes, which our bike lane program, we try to kind of keep as a separate program so that the backlash that comes with bike lanes doesn't get overlapped with into backlash against Vision Zero, but they do tie together. It's like part of the Vision Zero umbrella, especially in Kansas City, where our roads are just so wide, and that wideness and extra lanes is what makes our arterial roads dangerous. And so using that extra space, like framing it in a way of like, okay, we have this extra space, what do we do with it? We're putting bike lanes there. And so framing it in that way with that Vision Zero lens is kind of how we try to communicate it when we're labeling bike lanes as Vision Zero. But we're doing about 15 miles of protected bike lanes a year, which will continue for however long we can until there's no more arterials left, probably. But yeah, those are some of the things we're focused on. Additionally, we're applying for more and more funding through different, national grants, state grants, as many grants as we can get, we're applying for, and trying to get more established funding for our group instead of just like kind of dipping into the other pockets around the city, which isn't a problem. Like, we want to continue doing that, and we will continue doing that. Like, we've partnered with even utility companies who have been tearing up the road, and we'll continue to partner with them as like, if they're going to be tearing up an intersection that is on our high injury network, can we partner with them to go put it back in a safer way once they're done tearing up the road? So those are some of the partnerships we're working on. Additionally, like interdepartmental partnerships, like making sure that as we're installing this stuff internally and externally, we're educating our internal crews as to like why we're doing this and how they're best installed, because since we're doing some of this implementation kind of quickly, it doesn't always go out exactly in the most perfect way that it maybe should. And so using these like this year's installations and last year's installations as examples of like, maybe we shouldn't have done it this way, so we can learn from our mistakes and get better every year, but not letting that stop us. And so just learning and trying to gain momentum to get more funding is where we're at. We have passed our Vision Zero action plan. So implementing that, trying to work to maybe empower our Vision Zero action team to like help us implement specific things on that action plan, is something in mind. Because right now our like Vision Zero task force committee, we meet regularly and give updates, but somehow giving more specific tasks to them of like, hey, maybe you could advocate for this zoning policy to change, because it's not just about what Public Works is doing, it's also about like what the planning department is doing and what the health department is doing. And so kind of using that committee maybe in those sorts of ways. Those are some of the things we have, I guess, in our mind for continuing our work.
Jason, any last thoughts before we open it up to the attendees?
No, the only thing I'll say is that story that Bailey referred to is 31st Street, or our partnership with a utility company. If there's time, I would love to tell that story in detail. That was certainly one of our high points of the program, but I think it'd be more appropriate to turn it over to your group, and if there's any questions that we can answer.
Okay, let's open it up to the group. I'll ask my question a little later. Dawn, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes, we do. One moment. They're coming in quickly, which is a great sign. Aubrey asked, I'm glad you mentioned accountability. That's one of the things I was curious about. We're a city who has been waiting a decade on Metrolink expansion, which is our light rail, for over a decade. So assuming we could get buy-in, I'd like to know more about how we could keep momentum going when it comes to implementation and securing budget.
I mean, that's a really good question, and obviously a tough one. Bailey kind of answered it in one way already. I mean, we did have, we can't, say that we were the sole reason this thing happened. We had a change in leadership. We had a city councilman who came from Bikewa, KC, and then you heard the name City of Jersey City. We have a city manager that came from there who had a lot of experience with that. So they definitely gave us the cover to go do these things. But what's happening is the one thing I would add, but let's say you don't have that, and my thought is this, the city, city councils, mayors, and all that, obviously they're the decision makers, but they listen to people. And if you can get, these communities to organize and put forth these concepts and show, not only the Public Works Department, but the elected officials, hey, they want this. That I found that has gone a long way. Convincing the electeds that it's not just advocates, it's not just people looking into books, but it's these communities who truly want it. But that a little onus goes on the communities to get organized and to do all that.
All right, next one.
Yes, related to that, Bryce and Taylor, I'm going to combine both of your questions a little bit because they're very closely related. When council individuals pose added traffic congestion arguments when pushing back on traffic calming, what is typically their mindset on why that's such a problem, and what messages or data points were most effective in communicating the benefits of traffic calming? And additionally, were you able to shift to completely designing for your non-rush hour periods of traffic instead of the typical, let's plan for the most amount of traffic?
I'll take a first swing at that, but I'll be really curious because Bailey came on here a year or so ago, and so she's kind of has a fresher perspective than I do. But I find myself conflicted. I'm a professional engineer also. In this balance, if every answer is found in a book, then we don't need anybody. We have the books to tell us. And so with that being said, I mean, we all know that as long as we keep building more lanes, that will induce more traffic. That's fundamental. But for me personally, my personal philosophy is having a comprehensive approach and strategy to this. You can't make every corridor perfect for all users. And what I mean by that is we've got a streetcar system, right? That corridor the preference, the priority has to go to streetcar. We do need corridors like interstates and highways that are priority of highways, but we've got to make sure that we find those corridors where bicycles or pedestrians or transit or whatever mode it is, that people can believe and feel comfortable of maneuvering those corridors. But getting right to your question about convincing those, maybe the old school of thinking, the data, it truly is. We develop that high injury network. We can tell them how many people are dying and getting hurt in these intersections, and tell them these are the, slowing traffic down is the number one factor in these fatalities. And then having people with us, I call them ambassadors, those constituents that know their neighborhoods and know what they want in those neighborhoods. But I honestly, I've kind of danced around. There's really not a silver bullet, and we don't win them all, and be prepared, that people might not agree with you. A lot of times when we get the big no, we like to say, all right, if we can't do it here, where should we do it? Kind of pivot, turn the script back on the people saying no. And then oftentimes you land right where you started, and sometimes you end up with a better idea. But I'll tell you, Bailey has had to struggle with this. Now we dumped all this on her when she showed up. And so I'd be curious to hear what Bailey has to say on this question.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit more input on it. I think that in terms of answering the typical pushback, which is usually people not wanting to hear complaints from their constituents, I would say that's what I view council members' concerns are, responding with a seconds of delay like that it causes, like maybe it's up to 10 seconds extra on your corridor, at your intersection, and allowing that number to speak to them and compare it to the number of fatal and serious injury crashes that have happened there, and really just like let them sit with that. Additionally, I find it beneficial to just educate council members and leadership on how doing road diets can actually increase traffic throughput. Like a 4-to-3 conversion frequently makes traffic flow better than before. Like cars are actually getting through the corridor in a quicker amount of time, but at a slower speed, maybe. And so just like using those studies and that the evidence that is everywhere. I personally like to use People for Bikes. I think that's their website. They have a lot of studies listed on their website. I'm sure the Vision Zero Network does as well. But just like using FHWA resources and all of these studies that have already been done showing that it honestly doesn't affect the car in a negative way really at all. And framing it in a way too that we're not just focused on pedestrians and cyclists, but we're also focused on car crashes. That Vision Zero isn't just about bikes and peds as much as we need to prioritize those users. But slowing the roads down not only helps those users, but it also helps cars. And so frequently framing things in that way too, that these road diets and this Vision Zero work is helping all users of the road and not just one. So that's kind of.
Thank you, Bailey. Just remind people it is 7:54 by my microwave. Are there any other questions? Dawn?
Yes, Liz added, which might be a good way to end on, what thing have you been most proud of from your work so far? Maybe this is the moment that Jason could tell us that story.
Yeah, I'll give Bailey a chance to think. I'll tell that story because it is a high point. So 31st Street, if anybody's familiar with Kansas City, goes through an entertainment district nicknamed Martini Corner, and a lot of bars and restaurants, as well as just normal brick and mortar businesses in that corridor. It was just busy. People would want to cross the street, but it was just really full of cars. And so we have Spire, our gas company, who's doing a major infrastructure overhaul in Kansas City. A lot of roads ripped up for them. And at the same time, their community had organized and said, look, we want this road diet, even laid it out. And at that moment, we were not in a position to fund that. That was not on our radar. It was not in our capital improvement program. It was not on our high injury network at the moment. But we said, look, you organize your community. We'll bring everybody there and let's see what the support is. And they did. And we walked into that meeting and I looked at my boss, who's a public works director, and I said, yeah, we're going to do this, about 5 minutes into that meeting. And but the partnership came. So that utility company needed to restore some, but not all. They had to restore what they ripped up. And then we have a street resurfacing program. It wasn't next in line, but it was on the list. So what we did is we partnered with the utility company. They did their part, we did our part. We resurfaced the entire road and we painted out, basically we framed out this road diet complete street that they had come up with. So we painted out, we went from 4 lanes to 2 lanes with turn lanes at the intersections. And it's not done, but what we did is we were able to give them that canvas with the lines on it. And so now slowly but surely, they're doing fundraising, they're going to their council members to get things like planners to build in the curbs and things like that. So just the collaboration of something that could have been 5 years ago, we could have easily dismissed as a public works department, said we don't have the money, you don't have the money. But no, and getting back to Bailey's point, we used to have such this paralysis on both sides, the opponents and the advocates, of having to get everything perfect before we do everything. And that's just not the approach we take anymore. We know we're going to learn some things. We know we're not going to get it perfect. We know things are going to happen in stages. But sorry, I'm getting kind of preachy. Bailey, what are you most proud of so far?
Yeah, that story is great. And it's definitely a high point of this year's program. I think what I'm most proud of, I started in March, so I've only had maybe 9 years or 9 months of
Like 9 years.
9 months here in Kansas City. But I'm most proud of our public works department in our city for being yes men. Like Jason was saying, not being afraid to say no as much as we could, but giving the chance on all of this stuff. It's just exciting to be a part of and encouraging to be in the city and to hear advocates who are excited about what's happening. I guess that's what I'm most proud of in particular, probably the 19 lane miles of bike lanes that we installed this year, of protected bike lanes, not just painted, is really my baby of a project. So proud of getting those in, and also just proud of the support around the city to be able to get those done.
Well, thank you both. It is 7:58. I'm not sure we have enough time for another question, but I think, Dawn, we can take, if possible, the rest of the questions and farm them out and get some responses if that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. We can follow up with anyone who asked a question that wasn't able to get answered.
Okay, well, Tiffany is gone. We thanked her. We'll thank her again. Bailey and Jason, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it for the work you do in Kansas City, and maybe we'll get you over here in person to help us out in St. Louis. So with that, I would say thank you all for participating this evening. We will try and make this available in the next 2 or 3 or 4 days as a recording for everyone who wants it. And with that, I'll sign off and say goodnight to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you
luck.
all and good luck. Yeah.